Okay, now this little idea of being fast and fluid, great marketing buzzword, it actually has kind of dipped into the languages themselves. .NET 4.0 determined not to use Blend, and you just start typing away in Visual Studio, you will eventually get horrible hand cramping. Writing animation sequences on the fly in XAML is not pretty. Even with the newest version of Visual Studio, which has much, much more support for XAML, there's still no animation editing support beyond typing in the editor. And maybe now more than ever, Expression Blend is going to be really important to have some really good tool support to help us with these different transition effects. Okay, and I really hope that you guys have checked out Expression Blend. I used to be a pretty big naysayer about it. Then I, too, got horrible hand cramps, and I eventually jumped on board, and now I really like it a lot. I can't imagine not doing a XAML project without it. Okay, now, this little idea of being fast and fluid, great marketing buzzword, it actually has kind of dipped into the languages themselves. .NET 4.5 introduced a few new keywords to both C# and Visual Basic. And if you guys have been following the story of all the different releases of .NET, you probably remember that, some releases like 3.5, we just had a huge number of new language features. Pretty much all of them were there to support Link. And then in .NET 4.5, the languages didn't really get too many new features themselves, right? But we did get these guys. Async and await. Two new keywords that are available in both C# and VB, which are really awesome. What Microsoft has basically done is they have introduced in these languages keywords to work with asynchronous calls. Now, working with asynchronous calls has always been, I would say, easier under .NET than other systems I've worked with. Even back in the first release of .NET when we had asynchronous delegates, that was pretty sweet. And the threading library was pretty sweet. And then as .NET has kept marching along, we eventually got the task parallel library. Well, these keywords are going to be tapping in to the TPL. In fact, when we build up methods that are marked async, we typically make use of the task class. Okay. Let me actually flip over to Visual Studio again and just give you a little taste of how these new keywords can really help build out. And this is not something which is just for Windows 8, by the way. Remember, I'm running Windows 7, so I'm going to actually run a program right now that'll run under Windows 7. It would also run under Windows 8. But I'm going to tap into some of these new keywords here. Okay, so here's a super common situation. You have a user interface for the desktop. It doesn't matter if it's Windows Forms or WPF. Here I just use Windows Forms because it's just a little bit easier to talk about just the code than worry about the XAML. And you have this very common situation where you say, well, gosh, if the user clicks a button, I know I'm going to enter a long-running computation. And the last thing we want to do is have the primary thread locked up. So this is where programmers would start to write multi-threaded code. You still could certainly do that, but nowadays we have actual language support. So let's take a peek. Basically here I got 3 buttons, right? And that just illustrates 3 different ways to use these new keywords. And I got a text box. So if I have more than one thread doing the work, I should be able to be typing in this text box while the work is happening in the background, right? That's the idea. So let's just kind of take a peek at some of this. I think I'm going to start down. Let's see if I can remember my buttons here. Let's start with this one. Yeah, this guy here. Okay. So if the user clicks this button, I want to start a task asynchronously. First thing I'm going to do, I'm going to mark this method with the async keyword. look at what I'm going to do. I'm going to set the text property of the window to the return value of this method, but I also decorate it with the await keyword, right? So basically, I'm going to start this task asynchronously, so the primary thread is free to do his work. And then when the return value comes back, eventually, the text will be set for me, okay? So this method right here, you can see that I'm leveraging the task class of the TPL. Remember, my ultimate goal is I'm returning a string, but because he's set to an await request, I'm returning a task of string. Now, this little code example is pretty simple, but it does kind of assume you've worked with the TPL before. If any of this is like, what does all this mean? Don't worry about that. I think when you see it running, you'll get the gist of what's happening. But you can see when I run my task, I'm going to force the calling thread to wait for about 10 seconds. Now, again, if this was a single-threaded program, I would be locked for 10 seconds, right? Maybe I'll make that 5 seconds, just so we're not waiting here for 10 full seconds. Let's make that 5 seconds. 5 seconds. And then eventually I do return an actual string. So let's do that first one. I'm going to click my button, and I'm typing away. And eventually we should see, yep, the title just updated. The next button I want to show you here is just multiple awaits. So again, here I've marked this method with the async qualifier. And here I just want to spin off a series of different tasks, one after the other. Same idea where I'm just going to put that thread asleep. So this guy's going to wait around for 2 seconds, this one for 3, this one for 6. And again, I'm going to be setting the text of the window with the custom message. So let's try this. So let's keep your eyes up here, of course, right? I'll click this little button here. Type away. And eventually, your task should be done. There we go. Now, this is pretty tremendous to me because, notice what we're not having to do here. We're not having to do a bunch of anonymous delegates for the secondary thread to get back to the calling thread. I'm not having to say, this dot invoke and then worry about that on the UI thread. We get a lot of support from the framework now to do this. And again, this to me is just awesome. I remember back in my day, I remember writing all the threading code with the WinRT API in C, and boy, oh boy, that was not quite as simple as it is nowadays. I bet you I still have code out there some poor person is still trying to maintain. So it's always great when we get help at the language level. Cool. So I just want to give you a quick little example of these keywords doing some useful things for us. Oh, and here's just a quick little screenshot that reminds you of that. And then there's just the example of the code. Now let me talk about this next point. Remember, I very, very briefly mentioned this idea of snap. So because Windows 8 is really geared towards a large variety of devices, we have to keep in mind that, well, I have to make sure that my application scales to different resolutions. Good news, of course, for those of you that have been working with XAML-based APIs, vector graphics, that's a good thing, right? So we do get a lot of help just out of the box from that. And here are just some common sizes for a Windows 8 application. Now, here's one thing that you'll find very bizarre. I remember when I first got my hands on some pre-release drops of Windows 8, I put it on my test machine, and I'd noticed that I'd be clicking all my tiles, and nothing would happen. I didn't get any indication things would fail, just nothing would launch. So, of course, I go to the internet, start to search around, and it turns out if you are not in the correct resolution, your Metro-style apps will not launch. So there is a baseline, right, that the computer is expected to be in. and then a whole bunch of other resolutions that you can scale up or down to. If you ever get to that situation where you're like, man, I'm clicking on my tiles here and it just does a indentation of the tile, but the program never starts up, I would probably guess the chances are pretty good you're not in a fitting resolution.